agenda because people from the German Development Institute could not make it. So Peter Pawlicki and Kate Sullivan, not O'Sullivan, just Sullivan, not from Ireland, from England, well, from America, from the US. They're going to be presenting the work on they've been doing on sustainable public procurement in the Electronics Watch organization. So I have the pleasure to introduce them to you. Okay, Peter.
Thank you, everybody. So, when Kate and I were discussing what we want to present on, we kind of assumed that a lot of people here will be from the legal department and from the economics department. So we thought we will not talk too much about the rules. We will talk more about what is it and how to implement them, because that's actually the more important part, we do think. But we want to start with with this. So why should we talk about sustainable procurement of ICT? Why is it important? If you look at the electronics industry is an industry that has a low unionization rate globally. That means it's mostly in locations where unions are non-existent or very, very weak. The sector is rather anti-union. There are historical references to big guys before Mark Zuckerberg and Bezos and all these people that were really saying unions are bad. And historically, the electronics industry comes from Silicon Valley, which was always anti-union. So there is no unionization. You have a high fluctuation of production. So production is going up and down. How do you accommodate for that in a industry that does not care for workers? You basically get rid of workers, or you only have agency workers. The violations we are looking at, and I'm just now skimming the surface, we are looking at forced labor. Every product you own that has ICT in it has forced labor in it, unfortunately. Extremely low wages. So living wage is something that the industry does not think is important. They pay minimum wages. Minimum wages almost always translate into the need of workers to work 60, 70, 80 hours per week, so they can actually have a life. We have problems with occupational health and safety, with union busting, and we have very complex supply chains. This, everybody has seen a mouse. Oh no, I can use this now. Everybody has seen a mouse. This is the supply chain of a mouse. So a mouse is a really, really not complex product. You have one small printed circuit board that sits again. That doesn't work. No. Oh. So this thing is a printed circuit board. You have one controller, not a lot of electronics. That's the supply chain. So your laptop has probably 1,000 more complexity. This is actually very, very bad for anything that has to do with sustainable procurement, because how do you do due diligence if you have 1,000 components? That's a real challenge. But on the other hand, the electronics industry works on standardization. So every one of your laptops contains potentially around 90% of the same components. Whether it's an Apple, whether it's a Lenovo or an HP or a Dell, they will use an Intel processor. Well, Apple now shifted, but most of them still use Intel. Most of them still use the same memory produced by 3 companies worldwide. So there is a lot of overlap here. Most of them use the same final assembly techniques or the same final assembly suppliers. So companies like Foxconn or Flextronics or Jabil. Why am I telling you all of this? Because as a public buyer, when I want to impact something, I need to look at my subject matter of the contract. I can only ask for social criteria, environmental criteria for the subject matter of the contract. if you look at offices around Europe and the world, they use mostly 3 to 4 brands. That will be Lenovo, Dell, and HP in desktop and laptop computers. So what this means is I can actually look at very similar supply chains. Although they are very complex, there is a huge overlap. And that is where public procurement can actually have a leverage, because if you get some of these public buyers banded up in a group, they can talk to the industry. And this is now where Kate comes in.
Great. And before I actually start, we were talking about having the session right after lunch is really difficult because people's energy levels are low. So I'm going to ask that you smile and give me energy so that I'm awake also, because this is a low point for me. And unlike Peter, who's been doing this for several years, I'm new, so I have cue cards. I hope you're not offended, but I'm going to look down at my notes so that I don't forget things. The due diligence life cycle, we've already talked about a little bit. The reason I'm putting this up there isn't because it's new to anyone here, but I think it's useful to reflect on what type of information you would need to be able to act on and achieve each of these steps. And also it's helpful to understand the electronics watch model. I'd also like to say that I was at a conference last week for public buyers in the university sector, and the opening panel there was talking about the need to change the narrative about procurement from one that's a transactional function, just about purchasing, to one that delivers value, whether that's social, environmental, or cost. So keeping that in mind when we think about this, I'm going to ask some questions. Don't raise your hand. They're not hypothetical, but do shout them out. So going from the first step, what do you need? What information do you need to identify the risks in your supply chains? Anyone? Know the supply chain? You need to know your supply chains, right? You would think this is super obvious, but it's not. And so the visibility into the supply chain is obviously really challenging. As Peter pointed out, even the most simple piece of equipment, there's the mouse there, has
much more complex now.
Has loads and loads of components, and these go down layer by layer. And depending on who you're purchasing your equipment from, they may not have a contractual relationship at every tier, and they won't have a contractual relationship at every tier in the supply chain. So that visibility in the electronics industry requires disclosures from your suppliers. And do you think that they're interested in disclosing where their factories are? Probably not. Someone mentioned earlier, why would they give you that information if they know in an industry like electronics that you're going to find violations, you're going to find forced labor. In the mining sector, you could find child labor. Why would they want to do that? So as public buyers, it's a challenge to get them to disclose. And that means that you have to create an incentive structure whereby they know that transparency is something that you're demanding, that you're seeking, and that there's a system of continuous improvement, right? We're not trying to eliminate the risks entirely, but we want to make sure that they can be systemically addressed and not brushed under the rug. So let's assume that you have these disclosures, right? You have the information, you know the factories where your top products are being made, and you have an idea of some of the components and where those are being assembled. Then what do you do? Assess the risks, right? What information would you need as a public buyer to be able to do that? Anyone? How to assess them, right? So we've talked about some of the tools, and we'll go into that later. What kinds of capacity do you need? Time, resources. Are you going to go to China and follow up with all of the factories yourself? Right, okay. And that takes money. It takes time, it takes connections. And you have to understand the structure of the industry. You have to understand what the risks might look like and how they might differ in one country for a specific product, right? And factory. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you get the idea. So I would actually argue that monitoring, which is step 4 here, starts after step 1 and is continuous. But the point is that you need a lot of information, a lot of capacity, and a lot of resources to do this properly. And there are loads of tools at your disposal, and they have strengths and weaknesses. And we're going to talk a little bit about the ones that we focus on and some of the others that you can use to actually bring about change in your organization. But I wanted to focus a bit on the latter half of the chain here and talk about remedy a little bit, because that's a really important part of the work that we're doing and trying to develop with, actually Martina is already collaborating with us a bit on this. But one of the things that someone mentioned, and I can't remember who mentioned this in the first, one of the first presentations today, was who should be involved in the conversation. So when we talk about remedy, what do you think some of the steps would be in remediation? When you think about, you've found a violation, you know that there's a problem, now what? The victims, so the rights holders themselves, right? Are they usually a part of the conversation? No. This was pointed out in one of the slides this morning. It's usually between the public buyers and the companies, and that's it. What about the communities near the factories where things are happening, who are potentially affected by the operations? So it's about putting in place a process that allows these people to have access to remedy, and that's where industry engagement comes in. We won't go through all of the steps here, but I just wanted to point out that workers' rights criteria can be integrated into every single step of the procurement process. And we'll look into that a little bit more in a minute. Someone asked, who's doing what? Who's doing this? Is it the companies? Is it the buyers? Is it third parties? And the answer that Peter gave was it's all of them. And I think Rodrigo also mentioned this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what we do with public buyers to help them, because there is a capacity problem and there's a knowledge issue. And you sometimes have people who are working on multiple categories, they're under-resourced, they have very limited amount of time. We did a survey of our affiliates and found out that they have 3 hours a month to work on this stuff. How much can you really expect to achieve in 3 hours? So it's about helping them to be as efficient as possible with that time. Pre-tender, this is about strategizing and communication, helping them understand what they know and don't know, what resources are available and what those can help them do and not do. Developing criteria, technical specifications, contract obligations. I'm not going to read this, but you can get an idea of what's here. So this is what we work with them on in the different phases, depending on their level of maturity. And of course, some of those who we work with are kind of far ahead of the curve. And then we're focusing on where most of our due diligence model happens, which is in the contract performance phase. And the reason that we focus on this phase is there's a couple of them. First of all, public buyers have very long contracts. So 3 to 7 years gives you the opportunity to get transparency into your supply chain, to identify the risks and the violations, to seek remediation, and then to verify that the corrective actions have actually had the desired impact, right? Because a company might do something and say, well, we addressed the problem, but if you don't get that feedback from the workers themselves, that it's what was necessary, then who's to say that you've had a change on the ground? The other reason, as Peter mentioned, is that there is no such thing as fair ICT. It doesn't matter if you're buying from Apple or Dell or Lenovo or whomever, you're going to face the same structural issues. So one of the advantages of working with several public buyers at once is that we see all of the disclosure data together, and a lot of them have the same factories. So with this model that we put in place, which asks for transparency, so disclosing the factories and the compliance findings, collaboration with monitors, providing them factory access, right? So sometimes you'll hear, no, it's fine. We did our own self-check. There's no issues here, but don't come in. You can't come in. Just trust us on this. Well, no, of course, we're not going to trust you on that. And that also means no retaliation against whistleblowers, right? People feel that they can speak up and they know that something isn't going to happen to them if they do. And lastly, that there's remediation for violations.
That's me again. Thank you. Yes. So the most important part and the newest part is not the law in public procurement currently. It's actually how you perceive procurement. It took me around 2 years to understand that working with Electronic Swatch. And at one point, one procurator told me how procurement works for him. He sends out a tender. He receives some bids, he checks the bids, scores them, then there is a winner, then he signs a contract, and that's the first time he talks with the supplier. That's the old model. You can't do sustainable procurement with this. What you need to do with sustainable procurement is you have to do dialogue. You have to speak with the market, and you have to understand the market, but the market has to understand you too. How strongly you push the market is a strategic decision. It's not a decision that the market should be taking. It's a decision that you as a public buyer should be taking based on your analysis of resources, of how far you want to take things and all these other things, but you need to dialogue with the market. So market engagements are actually very, very important, very new tools. Most public buyers, I would estimate, I don't have a measurement, I would estimate 95 to 99% of public buyers in Europe have never heard about market engagement. So that's the question about who is doing it. Nobody. You have to get them there. They will feel uncomfortable about it because they don't know why. They very often will ask, especially you lawyers, is this allowed? Because previously it was actually not allowed to talk to the market. So this is really important, but they need market engagement are important to you as an organization of public buyers. You need to tell, where do I want to go? In 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years. I want to inform you as a market about my strategic goals. I want to inform you as a market about my specific approach. So how will I do it? Will I use criteria? Will I use contract conditions? Will I use everything? Will I push you very strongly, or will I rather rely on what you will deliver? And then obviously it is also about communicating about the tender. So all the technicalities that I have unfortunately no idea about. You can also discuss about what can the market deliver. That is also one thing. Public buyers will rather focus on this because they always want to know what can the market deliver. So if I put out a tender, I will get bids. That's their risk averse structure of thinking that they actually need to take. So learning about capabilities is really important, but then I always tell public buyers, you learn about the capabilities, what they can deliver. To make an incentive, you have to go at least one step further, because if you ask about what they can deliver, well, where's the incentive? They will just give you what they already have. So that's not a point. What we do is we don't look at criteria. So we don't look at award criteria or at selection criteria in the public procurement. We don't look at standards. So all these reporting standards or the auditing standards, we don't look at that. What we basically say is our public buyers, our affiliates basically can buy whatever they want. We don't care. Everything is bad. But what they put into place is contract conditions, and you can download those from our website. They're actually transposed in specific countries, so it's not only different languages, but also obviously the national legal framework. And what we need, as Kate already said, is we need to know first, and that's the most important part, supply chain transparency. So there is a contract condition. If you bid on this tender, you will be asked to disclose factories, final assembly. So this is where the products are actually assembled, but also on components. And this is again about the subject matter of the contract. We can't ask HP or Dell to change everything, but the public buyer can ask about the specific factory where the stuff is coming from to be compliant. Now there is a legal challenge here, because mostly public buyers buy from so-called resellers, so a company that would sell them HP products or HP. But not both organizations don't own the factory. So they have not control over really providing you with this details on factory detail on the factory details. So lawyers among this group, we then had really great lawyers that told us that we have to write in reasonable and proportionate endeavors have to be done to be compliant with the contract conditions. What does this mean? This basically means if you can tell me, you as the contractor, that you have written not only one email to HP, but you have written several emails to HP, and you have talked with the opposing party, and they are not willing to deliver these details, you are compliant with the contract, because you obviously have no control over HP. That is the big issue with supply chains. Supply chains, one of the reasons why supply chains have been developed is responsibility. I don't want to have responsibility of what is happening there. This is why I don't want to know what this factory is, and I don't want to disclose what this factory is. This is why we have to put this in legally. It's important. On a practical level, it's no difference. Because if a big customer, and we are talking about public buyers, about big customers, we are talking about customers that spend 10 million with you each year, they ask about things and you will answer. That's the good thing about capitalism. You have power. How does it look? Very boring. We have Excel files where we actually put in, for example, it's probably too small, but what it basically says is we sell a brand, product type, product line, product model. We need to know details. We don't need to know we buy from HP, because every product model might be produced in a different factory by a different brand, by a different company. So we need to know all of this. In the beginning, when I started to send this out around 2018, 2017, these things, I didn't get any information back. 1 year later, I get back bad information. Currently, we get back rather well. On the final assembly, the information looks good. It is right. On the component level, we are in a learning process once again. So this is about the learning process. They will not comply to your rules instantly, even if it's straightforward, because they don't know. They don't know how you want it, and they will always try to find a way out. That's kind of a given. That's a law. Unfortunately, I have not yet named it. So this is what we tell them in the contract conditions. But there is beyond contract conditions. You can do stuff. You're a big buyer. You are the Greater London Authority that spends not 10 million, but maybe 30 million a year on one contractor. What can you do? You can basically ask them to answer questions. And what you will do on a regular basis is you will meet your suppliers regularly. That's a standard. That's the previous model of delivery, where you had to discuss on logistics, on some technical issues, and all of these things. So this is something that procurers actually know about. This is called supplier engagement. What you can do now is you can infiltrate these discussions with sustainability questions. Start asking about, what do you do with sustainability? How do you make sure that we know about your supply chain? Think about a lot of questions, or ask us. We have a lot of questions always. The point is, even if it's not in the contract, you're a big buyer. Use this power. Make your procurers aware of this, that they have power. Sometimes it makes actually sense to not only talk about human rights issues, labor rights issues, but tell procurers you have power to make a difference. And that's important. They are big guys. They can do this stuff. Normally they don't. And that's kind of a mindset issue, because they are public buyers. In private companies, this is completely day-to-day business. Things are being just asked for, because I give you a lot of money, so you have to deliver things that I didn't put in the contract. This is a mindset we have to bring into public procurement. Again, this is a learning process. Hey.
I don't need that, but
Right.
So energy levels again. What are you giving me? What are you giving me? I see people like trooping down in the chairs. Just to build on what Peter was saying, somebody asked earlier about SMEs, and I think the same principle applies to public buyers. There are public buyers who are big, like the London Transport Authority. There are other really small municipalities who have limited resources, and they maybe have the person who's working on sustainability is also working on 30 million other things. The nice thing about the structure of our affiliate network is that we can pool together public buyers from all over Europe and Australia, which are the places where we have public buyers from, who have the same supply chains, and they can collectively put pressure on the brands and the resellers that they work with. So it's not just as an individual, but how do we learn with and grow together and apply leverage together? So last night, some of us were out at dinner, and one of the things that we were talking about was how we were talking about food and what we miss from our home countries or places that we've been to, that certain cuisine requires fresh produce, or it just doesn't taste good, right? If you don't have good tomatoes, if you don't have good octopus, that dish that your grandma makes, it's just not going to taste good. And the same thing is true with monitoring and verification. Crap in, crap out. So we've seen all of these indicators when we're talking about labels and certifications, and there's hundreds of thousands of them, and you can make numbers up. You could pick which figures you use, and you can shape the data in a way that it produces the results that you want to see. So I think the key when we talk about the monitoring work that we do in our approach is that it has to be credible, it has to be accurate, and it has to be verified. And that's just essential to completing really good due diligence. So we work with public buyers to establish strong verification standards. It's about, as Peter was saying, turning this around. They are the customer. They can set the bar. And obviously it does depend on what the market can deliver to an extent, but you can also continue to push the goalpost forward. Three things that I think we should consider here. One is independence. And I raise that because sometimes it's very obvious that there's a conflict of interest. When we talk about self-reporting, obviously companies, it's in their best interest not to tell you that they have child labor in their supply chains. They're not going to do that. If you ask me what my faults are, I'm going to give you a very curated and brief list. But if you ask Peter what my faults are, you're going to get a very extensive and detailed list of what those are, right? But in other cases, conflicts of interest might not be so evident. So for example, with audits, is the entity that is a third party commissioning or administering the audit, are they in any way financially dependent upon the company who's being audited? You see this quite a lot. And this is why corroboration of data is really important. Talking about methodological soundness, and this has been mentioned already this morning, there's no silver bullet for verification and for monitoring. There's not one tool. You can have this label, or you can use this certification, or you can have social audits, but at the end of the day, they all give you just a slice of the picture. So it's important to understand what each of these tools can deliver and how it can be used and what it can't do, so that you're not trying to force something to be used in a way that it can't be used. And one of the challenges that we face with public buyers a lot is they say, well, but there was a social audit on this factory and they didn't find anything. So there's no forced labor there. This is fine. We're all good, right? But auditors, when they come in, they have a closed list of questions. So you're only going to get answers to what you're looking for. And when we talk about our methodology in a moment, you'll understand how we try and overcome this challenge. It's not perfect, but it gets around some of this. Audit methodologies and detailed findings are also rarely shared with public buyers. So they get super aggregated reports. And then it's difficult to be able to glean insights about, for example, why something happened, right? So we can identify that we're 3 instances of X, Y, or Z happening, and they happen on these dates. But you don't have the contextual information to help you get at the root causes. And it's also not having information about the methodology makes it very difficult to interrogate anomalies, or when you have different information coming from different sources. So for example, if you had an audit that was conducted by the Responsible Business Alliance, or that they hired auditors to do that, and then we've done our monitoring and it produced very different results. Well, if you don't understand what evidence was being drawn on, if you don't understand the methodology, it's difficult to understand where the fault is coming from. Labels and certifications and ratings, they're great, right? I'm ISO certified with whatever the number is of the thousands, hundreds of thousands, or we use TCO. You hear this a lot, EP, SA 8000. It's fine, we've done this, we've gone through the process. And labels and certifications and ratings are really important tools, but they don't do everything, and they're not going to verify whether or not all of these violations that could be happening are or are not happening. So what are they good for? Incentivizing remediation. The threat of the withdrawal of a certification or label is really powerful motivator. They're also really effective at helping public buyers to compare the maturity of the due diligence systems. Again, we're talking about a management system, not the impact thereof, but that's useful if you're trying to compare suppliers. Worth mentioning also that not all label certifications rating schemes are equal, right? Some of them are very transparent about their methodology, about the criteria that they use, and some of them aren't at all. Some of them are very clear about the scope of their work, and some of them aren't at all. So it's difficult to understand the value that they can deliver if they're not transparent. And what we've seen is that most of the shortcomings of certifications and rating schemes, it has to do with the underlying audit systems that they use, right? So what do? We do worker-driven monitoring, which is a methodology that puts workers at the center. It reinforces their agency by empowering them to initiate investigations, to discuss the findings of the investigation, and also to be involved in developing solutions, so the remediation process. Our monitoring is carried out by civil society organizations in the manufacturing regions. Most of them have expertise in labor rights, and they're all trained in our methodology. The advantage of using our monitoring partners is that they understand the local context, they speak the local language, and they know how to reach out to workers in a way that isn't going to put them in harm's way. So one of the challenges that we see sometimes with social audits, when they reach out to workers, it can be on site. That can be very uncomfortable. If, you know, Rodrigo's sitting in this room, if Felipe there is being asked, you know, what kind of supervisor is he? I hear that he yells at his students. He said you did really crap work last week. So like, I mean, that guy right there, how is he? I'm being dramatic, of course, but it can be very uncomfortable when you're talking about serious violations to be able to report that on site when you know that your manager's nearby, and there could be very serious repercussions for your employment or for your well-being. So this is one of the things that we try and overcome. Trying to see if I've gone too far here. I want to go back. So the other thing that I want to say about our worker-driven monitoring methodology is that it's evidence-driven. So it requires corroboration from multiple sources of evidence, and it utilizes both quantitative and qualitative methods. One of the other things that distinguishes this tool from others is that it's fully transparent. So the methodology in full and all of the findings of all of our investigations are made available to our public buyers. And so if there are any questions, if we've made a mistake, if our monitoring partners have overlooked something, we can identify that and we can talk about it. So what do we look at here? I'm not going to read this, but you can see semi-structured offsite interviews. This is to make people feel safe, to feel that they can open up. Semi-structured meaning that you come with a list of questions, but that workers also have the opportunity to raise issues that we may not have thought of, right? We didn't know that this was even a potential problem. On-site interviews, observation, and surveys when possible, desk research, including document review. And then, of course, we analyze this against domestic and international laws and standards. Here too, won't read it all, but again, is it relevant? So which laws does it relate to? Which policies, which regulations? What's the harm to workers? So it may not be illegal, as Peter likes to say, it's not illegal in a lot of places to scream at people all day, but it's not very nice for them. So that could cause harm over time, psychological damage that's still worth investigating. Is it credible? Is there enough evidence of harm to be able to corroborate firsthand if possible? If not, you know, having multiple secondhand accounts can it be corroborated? And I think I'm back to you.
Yes. So what this monitoring gives us is an insight in what is happening. It's bad. That's what we basically can generally say. And that's where monitoring or reporting standards basically stop. Or that they might have some corrective action, but what we do now in our model is we go to the industry, meaning the brand, the manufacturer, which are mostly two different companies, and maybe the RBA, which is the Responsible Business Alliance. Kate mentioned it already. That's the industry association of the electronics industry. And we basically say, you signed a contract with our affiliates. We found violations. What do we do now? Please sit down at our table. Let's try to find a remediation. So that's the remediation process. And that is really important because compliance is not enough. Compliance basically means I kind of adhere to specific level laws and specific standards, but it's not actually driven also by the interest of workers. It is very important for our affiliates that we do this in a, let's say, collaborative way. That we, I mean, the major part is if local management in a factory doesn't buy into change, you will not see sustainable change. You will see some magic, and then you come back after 3 months and everything has reverted to zero. So you will need to see that. That's really actually the hardest part, because local management will always think about cost. Remediation costs money, and they have to mostly pick the tab up. It's not the brands that pay for this. That's a systemic problem that we also try to address. So this collaborative approach is really helpful when a number, and that's kind of the overlap of the supply chains that I kind of alluded to in the beginning. The more affiliates, public buyers we have that buy from one factory, the bigger the leverage, because the bigger the visibility of the industry, that it actually is not only this one city or this one public buyer, but it's more. This is really important for them. You can turn it around also. With electronic swatch, the industry actually has an easier way to work on remediation, because they don't have to answer questions to 30 or 40 or 400 different public buyers. They only ask and discuss things with us. We represent our affiliates in these remediation processes. Obviously, we also want our affiliates to push from the other side, but that's more of a strategic discussion. But this is something that the industry also realized. This is why we have signed a terms of engagement with the RBA that basically define the process after we deliver a monitoring report. This is something that wouldn't be happening 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, 10 years ago. But now they realize public procurement, and especially the sustainability public procurement, will not go away. So we have to kind of work with it. And that's really, really great. And we are done. I completely forgot that that's the last slide. But we have questions for you, because, I mean, maybe let's start with questions for us, right? Yes. So that's it. Questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm one of the ESRs, and I'm actually working on green and social contract conditions and public contracts. And from what I read so far, I understood that the obligations of means are not really effective in terms of contractual enforcement of them. And they can be used for greenwashing and social washing, because if I put in my contract that the contractor will show best efforts to act in accordance with blah, 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 it's not actually, you can ask for them before a court, but you and the contract laws that you share with us use the reasonable and proportionate endeavors. I was wondering if, do you think the obligations of means is required for electronic sector because the supply chain is complicated, or do you think it's applicable to all public contracts? And the second is, how can you, or how do you enforce the reasonable and proportionate measures?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the formulation reasonable, and I always forget what it is. This strange formulation has only been put in because of legal departments. The previous formulation was much stronger, but then nobody wanted to sign the contract conditions. So not to be against lawyers, but because of lawyers, we had to find a formulation that is actually in accordance with the objective structure of the supply chain. However, that does not, I don't want to say that that does not mean anything. This is just the legal part. The legal part, you never want to go back to the legal part, because if you have to go back to the legal part, everything in between that and our actions has failed. So all the processes that Kate and I have described are basically framed by the legal part, but they are the implementation part, and the implementation part is the most important one. You don't want to go back and use the escalation process that we have there to terminate a contract. You don't want ever to be doing that, because then you failed in your engagement. You could try to engage with your suppliers without the contract conditions. That's possible. That's the big buyer argument I made. This is technically possible. What you always need to do is have a source of data, whatever, qualitative, quantitative, that you actually trust, and that is independent of your supplier. That's kind of the most important part, because then you can understand, are they telling me the truth or are they bullshitting? If you have that, you don't need electronic swatch. We see public procurers that actually have enough resources that they can do own audits, mostly in countries like Sweden and Norway that are very rich, and have built up over the years systems where electronic swatch is just a small part. They have a lot of things. So the contractual conditions, that they are important as a kind of
Normative.
Yeah.
They send a signal about the expectations, but it's
Yeah.
a tool of last resort.
Yeah. You never want to flip them out. That's the worst part.
And-
Yes.
If you put something on a contract, in a public contract, and then you don't enforce it, it may require termination because you actually modified the contract.
Well, it's not about you enforce it, but you never want to go to be in a situation where you actually sit down and go with the legal department and say, okay, they broke this, because this means that the whole dialogue has broken down.
So just to
Yeah.
explain a little bit more, I think what Peter's trying to say is that if everything else is affected, you will never come to the point where you have to do that. So it's not about not enforcing it. It's about getting to a stage in the kind of maturity of your dialogue with your suppliers and with rights holders, that you don't ever have to be in that position. You absolutely could if you needed to, but that you would never have to enforce that because you're using these other tools. It's just there as a precaution, right? Does that make sense?
These other tools are rooted in the contract, but they are much more important than the legal language. The dialogue and the supply chain transparency and the tools that you have at hand, they are much more important than the contract conditions. The contract conditions basically just define the space where you're active in.
I think it would be good if you can provide us with the profit.
Yes, there are more questions.
And the point is, we don't want to involve the lawyers unless we really
Yes.
need to involve the lawyers.
Yes,
We can fix everything through mediation before having a big divorce. We'll do it through mediation. So more or less that way. So let's talk. If we talk and we talk and we talk and we can solve it, great. If we cannot solve it, let's bring the legal, we bring the lawyers, and then we have a divorce. But then after that, it becomes a big mess with the right and the supply, and we don't want to do that one. That's more or less what we want to do. But let's continue that conversation.
just one sentence to this. This is also the learning process. In the beginning, both sides will have no idea where they're heading to. We are providing a bit of a guidance. This depends also on resources. How much time do you have for this within your organization? You will get if you are consistent in your questions and supply chain engagement, you will get increasingly better answers and better impact, but you have to stay consistent. You have to ask regular questions. Yes, please.
And this one. And please send the list for the new more.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say two things. One is that yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but sometimes laws really matter. For example, for public interest.
Oh, yeah.
And for example, the supplier engagement, I found, for example, for public interest, it's very hard to engage a supplier because of anti-corruption laws. So I think that kind of reduce the possibility to do so, and especially for goods that they tend to buy over time, multiple times. It's not very easy for them to do market engagement. It's much more for the other kind of procurement, so
Yeah.
this sector would not be quite relevant for that. Second thing, in talking about global supply chains and where suppliers are located and so on and so forth. I was wondering whether you account for cultural differences. Because of course, we know that we have some standards, we have some laws in mind, we know that there are some suppliers where, for example, we prefer to work more on a short time, or even not having weekends off. I lived in Southeast Asia, they don't want to weekend off, we prefer to work. I mean, so there are cultural differences, we don't understand sometimes where we come from, and how we account for that. Third question is, how do you prevent double books? Again, some supplier, they know that they are going to be audited, and most of the time they also tend to have this very different books for different auditors. So if you have any mechanism in your way of managing that.
I can jump in on the second question. Sorry, the first one was about the
Corruption.
Anti-corruption law, how.
Anti-corruption law. Second, sorry, I just want to make sure.
Second was cultural differences.
Cultural differences, and the third was on double books. Okay, cultural differences. I mean, for us, the workers are the ones raising the concerns. So we're not going to jump in and do an investigation unless workers themselves have said there's a problem here. You know, we're being worked constantly. There's an issue. So that just wouldn't be an issue. On the double books question, some of the monitoring that we do is not necessarily, I mean, you can go into the factory, but it's also having conversations with workers outside of the factory, right? Doing unannounced, in some cases, when you have access, unannounced visits. So that's a really good way to overcome that. And also monitoring discussion boards. So public discussion boards, chat rooms and things where workers are going and speaking with the union representatives. It's not a perfect system, but it helps get around being presented with, okay, we know they're coming. We're going to make sure we're on our best behavior. It's like you're doing a tour of North Korea, right? You know, look at this shiny object. Don't look over there. Do this, do this.
If they're afraid to lose their job, do you think they will, you know?
That's a good question. So the cultural differences we don't go and do the monitoring. It's our local civil society organizations. They are, you know, they speak the language, they are born there, they know all of their stuff. Building up trust to have a, say, victim of sexual harassment tell you that the supervisor raped her. This takes time, and it sometimes fails. But we are willing to invest the time, which means several discussions, and we don't ask for this. If they come forward with this, we investigate them. So whatever is told us, we corroborate it. Obviously not with sexual harassment. We don't need corroboration for that. But we are proactively asking and building a space for workers to speak up, where they feel safe and they trust us. We then do work on this. So the measurement doesn't have an issue here. What we have an issue with, and that's kind of maybe the drawback that Kate has had in mind, this takes time, which is basically, it means we can't do 500 interviews. We may do 50. But being a qualitative researcher myself, 50 is enough. If 50 people will tell you in a even 10,000 workers factory, this is an issue, and it's unconnected interviews, then you have an issue. The corruption question. Supplier engagement is being done on a day-to-day basis. Basically, you are my contractor. I want to sit down every second week with you to know what are the deliveries, what is the timeline, what is the technical changes This is a standard communication device used by especially bigger procurements, procurers. Now you can use this to start talking about sustainability issues, be it environmental or be it social. This is something that most public buyers are not used to. There is no problem with corruption there, because this is basically you are checking your contract and their compliance with the contract with this. The pre-market engagement, there is, again, I'm not a lawyer, but there is, I think even in the directive of the EU, you are allowed to do this. You are actually supposed to be doing this. There is a lot of guidelines on how to do it. For example, you have to invite everybody, basically. Every potential bidder has to be invited. It has to be transparent, open, blah, blah, blah. If you fulfill this, talk to the market.
One of the things I will say, though, on prohibit things that are making it difficult for us, because the data, when we get disclosures, our general practice is that we use all that information and the monitoring information to inform our public affiliates, regardless if it's in their supply chain or not, right? So they're aware of risks that are emerging. There are some countries that have very strict, what do you call this, when competitive secrets, basically.
Yeah.
So basically, they can disclose the factories to the person with whom they have the contract, and they can maybe share it with us, but it can't go further. So NDAs are kind of determining how far, to what end we can use that information, and that can be prohibitive sometimes if we need to act on it, if we want to bring in others, because we can only share so much, or only so much detail has been shared with us. So that has been an issue.
And how did you solve this?
There's not an easy solution to this. I mean, it means we have a lot more conversations, because you have to duplicate, you know, instead of going out with one piece of information to 40 people, that means sometimes I can only have, you know, or Peter can have, or you can have a one-off conversation with them and a one-off conversation with them. And then we check the information internally, and we decide at what level we can communicate to be compliant with whatever the regulations are. But there's not a, yeah, exactly. And it's really, that's very different from country to country.
We have, yes, please, 2 more questions, and then we can give you.
Okay, so, just one, but thank you very much for this very interesting and very long presentation. My question is, if this right to repair becomes a serious stuff, how will this affect your model and checking what businesses do?
The
Right to
access to remedy?
No, right to repair.
The right to repair.
Yeah. Not a lot. To be very frank, what will happen potentially will be that public buyers or their IT departments will be capable of better maintenance, but they are doing this already. We are looking at organizations very often that procure 1,000 to 2,000 PCs per year. So if one PC breaks down, they basically often don't have the resources to repair this. They just send it in. There will be, I mean, when this is not only a law, but this is really implemented, then I hope you will have a better supply of components, which will enable the repair. This will have an impact on potentially looking at more circular models. But currently, be very aware if the electronics industry is talking about circularity. This is a marketing ploy currently. It basically means we will lease you a computer that you will give us back. That very often has the impact within the organization. You don't need an IT department anymore. So IT department will lose their jobs within your university. If you put this together, it might be actually a bad thing.
Last question, please.
No.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you first,
you do these investigations only for your affiliates, or can any public authority come to you and ask, please verify these companies, because I think it might be something there, or we are in the process of awarding the contract, so we need to know. That's one question. Two, are you quick enough to investigate during an award procedure, or mostly you work on the implementation of contracts because you have more time, long-term contracts, and have enough time to see whether the implementation goes the right way? And third one, if you investigate like as a usual practice, some companies, no, and can this investigation be
That's
then
four.
used-
That's one question. That's not four questions.
Can this investigation be used in the award procedures, because they are not linked with the subject matter of the contract that you have told. It's just, blank.
Yeah, so starting with 3, no, it can't be used. Because it's the subject matter of the contract. Second question was, are we quick enough? No, we are not. This is only really the contract management phase, because these investigations can take between 1 month and 8 months, whatever. The third one, yes, every public buyer can affiliate with us, and then we will monitor their supply chains. This obviously generates cost. We need to be funded. We are mostly funded by affiliates, so by public buyers in Europe and in Australia. We also get funding from grants, but mostly it's by public buyers. But every public buyer can affiliate. Affiliation fees range between, normally for universities of the size of Yevle, would be probably between 3,000 and 5,000 euros a year. Bigger organizations, like for example, Greater London Authority, will reach up to 50,000, 60,000 euros, but we basically say it's dependent on your procurement volume of hardware per year that you spend. And then you invest between 0.1% and 1% on sustainability, which is nothing.
Just to add to that, we do some consulting projects for organizations who aren't affiliates, but that's not supply chain monitoring. That might be, for example, tool development or strategy work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't run away, don't run away. Stay, sit, play there. So we have a little present from the University of Yale for such a great work. Can you please